Hello there, this is James S. Croft, EU James 1978, with the final addendum to this ongoing series, because having mentioned in Part 7 Links down the underbar that we now treat racism the same way that we've always regarded rape, I feel compelled to go into more detail about the connection between them. And to begin at the beginning then, although how dare you call us misogynists demand to know how we can possibly live in a rape culture when rape is illegal, for almost all of human history, including in the Old Testament, rape has been regarded as a property crime, committed not so much against the woman or girl, bearing in mind that the idea of men and boys being the victim of rape was never even considered, as much as it was against her husband, father, or the community to whom that woman or girl belonged. Meaning that even now, in the 21st century, although laws against rape, sexual assault, and what have you are slowly becoming less patriarchal and recognising these crimes as violations of bodily autonomy, as a society, our attitude towards women, and thus towards such crimes, is still rooted in this ancient patriarchal misogyny. For example, while pathetic whining misogynists often complain that women lie about having boyfriends, the reality is they are compelled to do so by the fact that the kind of hashtag nice guy scum who refuse to take no for an answer, becoming aggressive and even violent because she dares to simply not be attracted to him and or to not be interested in his generous offer, will often back down immediately when the woman states those magic words. Not because they respect the woman or even respect the fact that she already has a partner, with I have a girlfriend being taken as an opportunity to ask for a threesome or to watch, but because they respect another man's property. As a result, a straight married woman is slightly more likely to receive justice if she is raped or sexually assaulted by someone other than her husband, and significantly more likely to see him go to prison if the rapist is feared and condemned as a dangerous threat, for example, a white woman being raped by a black man or a Muslim refugee, while at the same time being far less likely to receive justice if she is raped by her male partner or ex-partner, the people who are by far the most likely to rape her because that's still her conjugal duty in the eyes of far too much of society. She's making a false accusation out of spite or what have you. And on the flip side of this misogynistically patriarchal coin, literally the only reason that sex work has ever been illegal in any society throughout history is that it gives women independence from men and male-dominated institutions such as the Catholic Church, which forces all of its nuns to remain celibate for life, with all of the moral and religious justification for the criminalisation and dehumanisation of sex workers, blaming them for everything from the spread of syphilis and other diseases to their own murder when serial killers from Jack the Ripper to the Yorkshire Ripper were targeting them because they were vulnerable, precisely because they were the easiest targets, always boiling down to, but a woman being independent of any man or male-dominated institution while remaining sexually active makes my tiny impotent wee-wee feel insecure, so she must be a disgusting whore. After all, the foundation of all patriarchal society is that the man shall be the head of the household and have absolute authority over his meek and obedient wife and children, meaning that a crime against those women and children is a violation of and insult to his power. And as a matter of fact, as John Stanley explains in his book How Fascism Works, this is why the basis of all fascism is absolute patriarchy, with the Führer or Duce being the father of the state, just as the man is the father of the family. It's the reason why, in spite of claiming to defend freedom, meaning their privilege and their power, conservatives, libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, and so forth love fascist governments that promise to oppress everyone else so that they can be quote-unquote free, always oppressing women and the LGBTQIA+ community under the guise of family values, because the man can't be the ruler of his own tin-pot little fiefdom and raise the next generation of loyal citizens if his wife is corrupted by the witchcraft of feminism and leaves him for another woman, or worse, he is corrupted by the gay agenda, leaving her for another man, or most terrifyingly of all, the trans agenda, becoming a woman himself. Ah! And this being the case, the perception of rape as a property crime, as a violation of the man's authority, is also the reason why so-called men's rights activism and the rest of the manosphere is a gateway to white supremacy and fascism, because when you enter this patriarchal mindset, you become terrified of the other undermining your power by violating your property rights. Indeed, as Innuendo Studios discusses in his video The Semiotics of Cuck, links down in the underbar, the kind of white men who ride the helter-skelter from inceldom, so-called men's rights activism, or any other aspect of the manosphere down to outright white supremacy and fascism are both infatuated with and intimidated by hypermasculinity, idolizing the testosterone-charged Neanderthal fantasy of bashing your next sexual conquest over the head and dragging her into your cave, and therefore being envious of the racist stereotype and fantasy of the hypermasculine black savage and Persian harems, but at the same time also worshipping the ideal of Western, read white civilization, idolizing the noble, intellectually and culturally superior European Ubermensch who overcame their base desires and brought technology and enlightenment to the world, with this strange mixture of fear and fascination being the reason why interracial porn, meaning exclusively black men having sex with white women, is one of the most popular fetishes on the internet, with white men literally paying to be humiliated, emasculated and cuckolded by proxy before opening Facebook, Reddit or Twitter and raging about the invasion of inferior black and brown people who are coming to steal our women's. As John Stanley explains in the chapter of his book discussing sexual anxiety, from Trump condemning Mexicans as rapists to Barry Goldwater dressing white girls in white dresses and surrounding them with white flowers while raging against the dangers of crime in the civil rights era South, just in case the dog whistle was too subtle for you there, and from To Kill a Mockingbird and women in old westerns being told to save the last bullet for themselves, to the 21st century boogeymen of Muslimic rape gangs, love jihad, and Mexican gangs trafficking white American women to be used as sex slaves by Mexican men, when the opposite is actually the case. What we know as the right and the far right's greatest fear, but also in many cases their greatest fetish, is having their masculinity and thus their power violated and their true people's superior blood polluted by the inferior other stealing their women's, condemning it as rape regardless of whether it was consensual or never even happened at all, because women being free to choose what happens to their own bodies? What kind of leftist feminazi communism is that? Remember, just as Trump getting all of his quote-unquote black friends to come up on stage and talk about how definitely not racist he is and how much he's done for black people wasn't an attempt to reach out to black voters, but to reassure white I'm not racist, but Trump's appeal to suburban housewives, when demographically speaking that voting bloc is dead to him, is not aimed at women at all, but rather at paranoid, definitely not racist but white men who are desperate to protect their womenfolk. In other words, Trump's foundational voting base. So when talking about racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and above all fascism, it's vital to understand just how important the fear of the other stealing our women's is to the entire basis of those bigoted conspiracy theories. That the defining backbone of racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and what have you is the fear of them taking our women's, regardless of whether the women's in question were ours in the first place, whether they wanted to leave or not, or even if there was any kind of genuine threat at all. Because as Innuendo Studios also explains in his video links down in the underbar, for a white man to be perceived as not having total unquestioned authority over his woman, regardless of whether that woman is literal or metaphorical, with the border or his country or his company counting as his woman in this context, is to be emasculated, weak and unworthy of the power that fascists seek to grant him in their superior white supremacist patriarchy, this being the reason why cuck is used as an insult against anyone who isn't sufficiently racist or misogynistic, from socialists to so-called cuck-conservatives. As always then, just as the crusades against abortion and #grooming are about the fear of losing control over women and children, the condemnation of rape has almost nothing to do with protecting the victims and everything to do with power, with the entire question of whether it was rape revolving not around whether a crime was even committed, but whether the dominant in-group are feeling existentially threatened in that moment by the inferior out-group being uppity and no longer knowing their place. For decades in the Deep South, lynching was justified by the self-righteously bigoted rationalisation that it was the only way to deter savage African beasts from raping white women, and was so much a part of the South's accepted narrative that when statistics finally demonstrated that most victims of lynchings weren't even accused of rape, white Southerners refused to believe it because doing so would mean abandoning a valid-sounding justification for their self-serving fear of losing their superior status in an increasingly equal society.
I want you all to hear 8 out of thousands of reasons Black people were lynched, according to the Equal Justice Initiative's report of reported lynchings. John Stoner was lynched in Dawes, Louisiana in 1909 for swinging the white man who killed his cow. Frank Dodd was lynched in DeWitt, Arkansas in 1916 for annoying a white woman. Ernest Green and Charlie Lang, both 14, were lynched in Shibuya, Mississippi in 1942 after a white girl said they were threatening. Oliver Moore was lynched in Edgecombe County, North Carolina in 1930 for frightening a white girl. Henry Patterson was lynched in Mobile, Florida in 1926 for asking a white woman for a drink of water. Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched in Birmingham, Alabama in 1933 for reprimanding white children who threw rocks at her. Jesse Thornton was lynched in Laverne, Alabama in 1940 for addressing a white police officer without the title Mr. A Black construction worker was lynched at Camp Blanding, Florida in 1941 for insisting that a white co-worker return his shovel.
So bringing this all the way back around then to answer the I'm not misogynistic buts question, we live in a rape culture because although the letter of the law is no longer quite as reprehensible, the way that society, including police, judges and juries perceive and thus apply that law is still as property crimes, still to this very day, often ignoring male victims completely unless they're using them as a disingenuous whataboutism to shut down feminists, because those victims aren't patriarchal property, since the violation of men and boys is only perceived as the destruction of their masculinity, not as an existential threat to societies as a whole. Meaning that just as white men carrying semi-automatic rifles who've just committed murder can wave at police and pass them without let or hindrance, while an unarmed black man is shot 7 times in the back because he might have had a gun, when a single woman, a woman in a same-sex relationship, a sex worker, or, God forbid, a trans woman is raped by a member of the dominant social group, in our case, straight, white, cisgendered men, then it's her own fault, it's buyer's remorse, she's making false allegations to destroy him, and so on and so forth. We also have to take into consideration how any conviction or even accusation of rape or sexual assault will damage the poor innocent white boy's future and hurt his delicate feelings. Where? But when there is even the slightest suggestion that a woman, particularly a married woman, could even potentially have been raped by a member of the degenerate and inferior outgroup, even when there is no evidence whatsoever that there was any physical contact of any kind, sexual, consensual, or otherwise, let alone that one particular man or group of men were the perpetrators, then saddle up, boys, there's gonna be a lynching.